Hello, it's wonderful to be here with you today, connecting about the positive effect of perceived contact with the dead, an exploratory study of the transformative power of personal development workshops. I'm going to be sharing with you about that topic, perceived contact with the dead, and starting by giving you a little bit of background about the Institute of Noetic Sciences Discovery Lab, where this data was collected, about our overall hypothesis, our primary outcome results, our exploratory outcome results, and the next steps in this research project. So in terms of background, at IONS, or the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we have a guiding hypothesis that everything is interconnected and that embodying that awareness reveals information and energy not limited by space and time, which in turn can then profoundly amplify transformation, innovation, and well-being. And we feel that the best way to study this hypothesis is through what we call the Noetic Handshake, which is a partnership between science and direct experience. And so the IONS Discovery Lab was birthed from this concept and from our beautiful retreat center in Northern California, where we had many groups teaching transformative practices coming to hold their workshops on the land. And we wanted to be able to capitalize on all those people coming through to be able to evaluate transformative practices and how they influence three factors that are directly linked to our guiding hypothesis. Factor one is interconnectedness. Factor two is revealing information and energy not limited by time and space, or extended human capacities, or psi. And factor three is transformation, innovation, and well-being. So why are we hypothesizing that everything is interconnected? Well, we know that at the point of time of the Big Bang, that everything was connected. And we also know through mainstream physics that quantum entanglement demonstrates this interconnection theoretically and also experimentally. We have demonstrations of entanglement experimentally confirmed with photons, neutrinos, electrons, molecules the size of buckyballs, and even small diamonds. In an MIT experiment, quantum entanglement was demonstrated with light from distant ancient quasars, which are luminous energetic galactic nuclei. And this light was actually emitted 7.8 billion years ago and 12.2 billion years ago. We also experience interconnectedness subjectively. Numerous people around the world have had transcendent oneness experiences or samadhi experiences where they have a subjective sense that they are interconnected to everything that is. So that was factor one. What about factor two? So obviously here at the Parapsychological Association and SSE conference, we're very well versed in extended human capacities and psi. There's obviously many names ascribed to this experience, and many of you are probably familiar with this paper by Etzel Cardania that was published in the American Psychologist, doing a review of meta-analyses of some of these phenomena. And then factor three is well-being, and well-being, improvements in pain, quality of life, overall quality of life, and creativity. So here we see a picture of Frederick August Kekule, who had a daydream. He was in a trance-like state and envisioned a snake eating its tail, which gave him the idea for the cyclical nature of benzene. And that structure was stumping him. He couldn't figure out its structure, and that daydream inspired him to discover that structure. So with these three factors in mind, we developed a measurement battery to be able to evaluate it. To do that, we chose measures that were validated, that were related to those 3 factors. They had to be concise because we wanted to give it before and after these transformative workshops. And we also included subjective and objective measures. So we ended up with subjective questionnaires, online tasks, also physiology with EEG and EKG. And the surveys take about 20 to 25 minutes for the survey before the workshop, and about 15 minutes for the survey after the workshop. So here, just an example of one of the interconnectedness items. People do this through SurveyMonkey. We also have a number of online tasks looking at the psi abilities, a time estimation task, an intuition task where people guess how many objects are in a jar, remote viewing task where people choose one of 5 pictures that are going to show up in the gray box, a creativity task where they list out all the different uses of specific common household items, the BEM precognition task, and a psychokinesis task. When we were able to do this at our retreat center in person, we also had EEG using a Muse device and EKG that we correlated with the EEG and the other measures. And when those are the core measures, and then people can also work with us to look at additional measures like 64-channel EEG and other biomarkers. So those are the 3 factors, a general overview of the measures. There were 3 specific research questions that we were asking of this IONS Discovery Lab data. So 1, what is the relationship between these factors? 2, are there any interventions, components, or specific experiences that influence these factors the most? And then 3, are there any predictors about the people or the workshops themselves that influenced the outcomes? So I'll be sharing about the results of these specific research questions as we go on. Another goal of the IONS Discovery Lab is to be a service to the community of people doing workshops in this field. There's limited research that's been conducted on these transformative practices. So we provide a report for workshop leaders who participate in the IONS Discovery Lab so they can see how their workshops affect their participants. So let's get into the results of the phase 1 of the IONS Discovery Lab. So first, give you a little sense of who completed the surveys. So we had about 1,200 people who completed the pre-survey before any sort of workshop. And this is the group of people that we looked at for the relationship between the factors. Then we had 534 pre-post records, so paired data from the surveys before and after transformative workshops. You'll notice that, this number here is 521 because some people took the workshop more than once. So they're just included once in this demographic table. You'll see that people were mostly middle-aged, well-educated, more men than women, and mostly Caucasian, but some diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, and mostly not in relationship. So let's look at the relationship between the different variables of interconnectedness, psi, and well-being. If we look at correlations between these, there were 34 significant correlations, 29 of which were significant at less than 0.0005 p-value level. The interconnectedness measures were moderately correlated with each other. which we would expect. There was only one psi task that had a relationship with any of the other measures, and that was with interconnectedness with others. No other psi measure correlated with anything else. The interconnectedness measures were also highly correlated with the well-being measures, and that ranged here from 0.27 to 0.33, and all of these were highly significant at various strengths. And unsurprisingly, the various well-being measures correlated with themselves as well. So just to give you a sense for these acronyms, AIOS is the Arizona Integrative Outcome Scale. It's a general well-being scale. PA is positive affect, NA is negative affect, COMP is compassion, sleep 24 is sleep disturbance over the last 24 hours, and PN 24 is pain. And in terms of these values here, if it's bolded and underlined, that means it was significant at less than 0.00005, and just bold without the underline is significant at less than 0.0428. That value was chosen because we did a false discovery rate multiple comparison correction, and that's the p-value at which was determined to be significant. Another way to look at that data is with this graphic here. And what we see is that the well-being measures and the interconnectedness measures were related to each other, but the well-being and the extended human capacity was not. So that's our first question. Moving now to our second research question, looking at the pre-post data. So what were the changes from before to after these transformative practices? We had 33 different types of workshops represented. And like I mentioned, there were 534 pre-post records. The average workshop length was quite variable from, as short as 2 hours to as long as 10 months. We didn't restrict the workshops in terms of those characteristics. Overall, looking at this table here, we see that there were improvements in all of the well-being measures. And just to clarify, this is looking at the data of all the workshops together. So at this point, we're just lumping all that data together. And we see improvements in all of the well-being measures. We also see improvements in all of the subjective interconnectedness measures. In terms of the psi tasks, we don't see any significant changes in those, except for remote viewing, where it was a little bit slightly above chance before the workshop and slightly below chance after the workshop. And that was a significant finding for the remote viewing. In terms of looking at predictors and what influences the outcomes, we looked at workshop format. So there was lecture, small group, discussion, pairs, movement, and being outside in nature. And the way these were selected is the workshop leader was asked before they participated to define the characteristics of their workshop. So these were the formats that the workshop leaders used, and this is listed in order of prevalence. So lecture was used by 22 groups, small groups 19, and going on down with 9 groups using nature or being outside in nature. They also checked the type of practices that they did during the workshops. And this is again listed in higher to lower use in the workshops. Meditation and contemplation was the most used. Positive psychology, spirituality, health and healing, intention, intuition, nature practices, embodied practices, art, death and dying and beyond, sound healing, parapsychology and psi. Actually, data from the last PA conference is included in this data set because it was done at the Earthrise campus and people completed the Ions Discovery Lab survey before and after that conference. So that's kind of fun to have this data included here. Technology tools, altered states of consciousness, and dream work. These last two were not included in the predictor analysis because there were only one workshop for each of those that included that. So looking at this data, I know this is kind of a busy slide here. What's included here is the results of the predictor analysis of the significant predictors. So the top ones are the workshop formats. So these four formats predicted changes in the well-being measures, AIOS, PA change, NA change, compassion, sleep, and pain. And so what we see here as an example is the small group workshop format was associated with a negative 5.39 change in the AIOS score, and that's with everything else being fixed. So what does that mean? It means that the well-being score actually went down if people had a small group format, which is kind of unique and interesting. None of these workshop formats predicted any of the 3 interconnectedness measures. So they only predicted well-being measures. And then only the discussion format predicted any of the psi measures, which was the remote viewing change and the intuition change, and the time estimation change and the bubble change. In terms of workshop content, meditation and technology tool workshop content predicted well-being changes. For example, the meditation workshop content was associated with a positive 3.61 point change in the AIOS well-being score, and no other workshop content variables were significant for any of the other outcomes. And then finally, looking at the demographic predictors of age, gender, education, relationship, race, and income, those did not predict any outcome variable. The only thing that did show up was the personality trait of conscientiousness, which predicted some well-being outcomes, but the direction of the association was quite varied. For example, conscientiousness was associated with decreased overall well-being scores, but improved sleep disturbance and pain. So this is just, this question here, research question, is very pilot exploratory in this phase 1. And so we need a lot more data to be able to look at these in more detail and get more definitive answers for that specific question. I'm going to shift gears now and talk about some more exploratory measures we looked at, which are basically people's self-report transformative experiences. So most people who participated, this is again pre-post data, shared historically that they had an important event that negatively affected their life and their behavior as well. And that in their past, they had a moment of clarity or profound insight that changed their life and their behavior. So this is looking at people's previous history with transformation. Looking at how they transformed from the workshops, most participants felt that they positively changed because of the workshop and believed that their behavior would change as well. And about 3/4 said that they had a moment of profound clarity or insight during the workshop that they felt would change their behavior and relationships after the workshop. When we looked at all of these variables as predictors for outcomes of interconnectedness, well-being, and psi, none of them were significant predictors. The next class of experiences that we looked at from the workshop were what you might call paranormal or noetic experiences. 65% of the participants checked that they had at least one of these experiences during their workshops. And just to give you a sense of some of those, the most endorsed was an experience that my consciousness is not limited to my brain or body, gaining information about the thoughts, feelings, or circumstances of another person in a way that does not depend on rational prediction or normal sensory channels, and a hunch that turned out to be correct, not just by coincidence. So those were the top 3 noetic experiences that people had in their workshop. On average, people who checked at least one item also checked about 3 items. So if they checked one, they actually checked more than one. What's interesting in terms of the prediction here is that this item, PE6, contact with the dead, was actually a significant predictor for improvements in interconnectedness and well-being at a value, at a p-value that survived multiple comparison correction. And so thus the title of this talk in terms of perceiving contact with the dead and improvements during personal growth workshops. And we'll talk a little bit more about the potential implications for that in a moment. In terms of transpersonal and relational experiences, 84% of the participants marked that they had at least one of those during their workshop. The top 3 endorsed were meaningful experiences with a person, place, or thing, a strong connection with the teacher, and other experiences. And in terms of prediction, meaningful connection with wildlife and animals predicted improvement in interconnectedness, and meaningful experience with a person, place, or thing predicted improvement in well-being scores. You see this lighter purple here. These values are, p-values are below 0.05, but they didn't pass our multiple comparison correction. So in summary, what are the implications of what we found here? So in general, subjective sense of interconnectedness and well-being are positively correlated, but psi task performance was not correlated with those other 2 factors. Personal development activities in general increase subjective interconnectedness, well-being, positive emotion, and compassion. They decrease sleep disturbance, negative emotion, and pain, and they're positively transformative. Very interestingly, the experience of perceiving contact with the dead during the workshop resulted in greater improvements in the score, as well as meaningful experiences with a person, place, thing, wildlife, or animals. We think this piece about contact with the dead is really important because the workshops were not designed, they weren't mediumship workshops or channeling workshops. They weren't focused on that type of content, and yet people were still having these experiences, which is quite fascinating. And of course, with the predictors, more research is definitely needed. So in terms of contact with the dead, this is a common worldwide prevalence. It's very common worldwide, ranging from 25 to 66% of people surveyed have expressed that they have had contact with the dead. And there's numerous studies showing that there's positive benefit from this experience, not just from these transformative workshops as we've seen, but also globally around the world. There's also studies showing that this process can support grief. Contact with the dead through mediumship sessions support the grief process and resolution, and the growing deep pathologizing of communication with the dead allows people to speak about it more openly and feel a greater sense of community. So what are the next steps in terms of this work? The pilot study is complete. So phase 1 of the IONS Discovery Lab is complete. And those are the results that I shared with you today. We have 2 papers about these results under review right now. We've also translated the survey into 6 different languages and are currently collecting data for version 2.0, which has been pre-registered at Kessler. And we are recruiting groups worldwide who speak these languages to be able to be part of the IONS Discovery Lab and do our formal analysis about these research questions where we've done power calculations and get enough data to really be able to answer them significantly, definitively. If you're interested in learning more about the IONS Discovery Lab, you can go to this website and learn more about it. And also just want to offer deep gratitude to all of the groups that have supported this work: John Sperling, John Brockway Huntington, Patricia Beck Phillips, and IONS members, our science team, and our staff. Thank you.